Good afternoon. Today we will be talking about LGBTQ youth of color regarding our community asset mapping presentation. This presentation is by Sophia Robinson, Emily Seekings, Mary Ramatzi, and Lily Tenya. We are group 4007. Thank you and hope you enjoy. The first section is about the background information for our population of focus. We will explore who is affected, how they are affected, and the dimensions of the underlying social conditions. Currently, we do not have accurate data that reflects the number of queer youth of color in Colorado. A needs assessment by One Colorado was conducted in 2016 and gathered information about the LGBTQ population in Colorado. Though there are no figures that focus on queer youth of color specifically, we can see that there are many who identify as an ethnic minority and are multiracial. This particular study did not include minors. However, we can note that every individual in this study were youth at some point. Additionally, there was a study conducted in 2017 by the Human Rights Campaign Foundation, partnered with the University of Connecticut. Over 12,000 youth between the ages of 13 and 17 participated from all 50 states. Of the 4,700 youth of color that participated, 80% reported personally experiencing racism. These figures exemplify the complexity with intersectional identities that are marginalized in isolation. Therefore, the identities of being an LGBTQ youth of color yields even more complication. Statistics from the One Colorado Needs Assessment shows how prevalent bullying was in their childhood, as well as the prevalence of issues like homophobia, transphobia, and other types of harassments are in adulthood. Now, let's look at how they are affected. We found four main aspects, which include homelessness, bullying, substance use, and mental health. In general, LGBTQ youth are more likely to experience homelessness, bullying, substance use, and mental health problems. LGBTQ youth are more than 120% more likely to become homeless. They experience the highest rates of bullying and threats of safety. 65% have experienced physical violence or verbal harassment because of gender identity, and 64% experience physical violence or verbal harassment because of sexual orientation. Queer youth of color are more likely to use drugs, binge drink, and smoke tobacco, and experience mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and suicide. The transgender identity adds another layer, as these students are more than 2 times as likely to consider suicide and 5 times as likely to attempt suicide as their cisgender peers. 48% thought about or attempted suicide in 2018. The issue of safety is a prevalent issue when we examine the rates of sexual violence, verbal threats, and bullying. Other issues like using public restrooms and family and peer acceptance also greatly affect the queer youth community. Any issue of safety is an indicator of power, privilege, and oppression, and it signifies an imbalance between the majority group, which are cisgender, heterosexual, Caucasian descent, and the minority, LGBTQ youth of color. There are many different dimensions of the underlying social conditions related to LGBTQ youth of color that often overlap and are not linear. First, racism is experienced by many LGBTQ youth due to the color of their skin as well as their sexual orientation and other intersecting identities. Second, there exists a lack of support and resources in schools that leads to LGBTQ ethnic minorities feeling ostracized, pushed out of schools, and are more likely to be blamed for their own victimization. Additionally, predominant conservative and religious systems are present and view anything other than heterosexual marriage as a sin. This population tends to lack understanding and are in disagreements with progressive populations about how to define and recognize gender identity and physical sex. Another underlying social condition are the policies that control sexual orientation by deciding who gets to marry whom. Certain policies do not recognize a distinction between sex and gender identification. This is because they do not acknowledge gender identity as fluid. Sex at birth does not always define gender identification. Furthermore, culture is an important component due to its prevalence in people's lives. Many cultures do not support the LGBTQ community. Lastly, due to the aforementioned underlying social conditions, some families do not accept their queer family members.
The next section will map some of the assets of the LGBTQ community with a highlight on the queer youth of color. We will look at the talents and skills of the people, community volunteer groups and networks, government and non-government organizations, and stories. Within every community, each member contributes something unique and valuable. It is imperative to acknowledge these various capacities of importance in order for a community to be thriving. For instance, when a community is acknowledging and recognizing the different respective assets, then the members feel like they are contributors to the community building process. Identifying the diversity and abundance of skills each possesses, acknowledging their vast knowledge on the topic, and encouraging their expression of personal experience, a community can prosper and grow in richness. When individuals of the LGBTQ community come together as one collective group, change and progress can occur. Each member has something special and unique that they can contribute to the group that has a positive effect on the community. When this happens, positive change and progress occur within the community. We would like to note our attempts to talk with Rainbow Alley Youth of Color and were unsuccessful setting up interviews in the time allotted. We point this out because we do not want to assume or tell anecdotes that are not ours to share. Rainbow Alley is a perfect example of a community center with robust programming and services that also has a wide network of community volunteers. Volunteers at Rainbow Alley have many options, which include greeting visitors at the front desk, facilitating small groups, and helping the Denver Pride Fest. Rainbow Alley provides a space for members and allies to learn from one another and to also brainstorm ideas and solutions as a team in order to continue the good fight, which essentially is to be represented in spaces that weren't made for communities like theirs. Please pause the presentation and click on the link in the description to view the video to learn more about Rainbow Alley. Rainbow Alley has a youth group specifically for queer and trans people of color that uses the acronym QTPOC. QTPOC experience marginalization at the intersection of racism, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, queerphobia, and transphobia. As a result, QTPOC, especially youth, experience high rates of homelessness, poverty, and violence. Even though the queer liberation movement was spurred by the work of poor and working-class trans women of color, today's LGBTQA+ movement is largely and unfairly dominated by white upper and middle-class gay and lesbian communities. At the same time, LGBTQA+ identity is often underrepresented within communities of color. In practicing a politics of liberation, it is vital to center the needs and experiences of QTPOC and other communities experiencing multiple forms of oppression. This group is led by queer youth and community members of color and is meant to be a place to discuss their experiences, identities, and issues. Several non-governmental organizations in Colorado that serve the LGBTQ community are Inside Out Youth Services, Out Boulder County, Open Door Fund, and Support Pride Learning and Social Happenings, also known as SPLASH. The organizations that address the LGBTQ youth specifically are Rainbow Alley, Inside Out Youth Services, and Support Pride Learning and Social Happenings. These three organizations aim to provide not only group support for queer youth, but educational and advocacy services as well. Neither Inside Out Youth Services or SPLASH advertise groups or programs for youth of color. However, this does not mean that they are non-existent. There is the possibility that queer youth of color have created their own informal support system. It is important to observe and recognize the implications and what it means to have only one LGBTQ youth organization have an intentional and formal group for youth of color. For example, this could be reflective of the greater Colorado LGBTQ culture not recognizing the intersectionality of sexuality, gender, and race. There does not appear to be government-funded programs for LGBTQ youth of color. On the Denver, the Mile High City government website, there is information about the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, and Queer Commission under the Human Rights and Community Partnerships page. This commission takes a social action approach in the way it's intended to expose problems the LGBTQ community faces and propose legislation and policies that would benefit said community, as well as support mobilization and educational efforts. This commission does not advertise a focus on issues facing queer youth of color, nor does it imply that they include them in the discussion surrounding the LGBTQ community as a whole. At a national level, there are several non-governmental programs that serve the LGBTQ population: the It Gets Better Project and the Trevor Project. Though there is not a specified focus on queer people of color or youth, this campaign advertises itself as a global initiative that connects the community around the world. The other organization mentioned, that is at the national level, is the Trevor Project. This nonprofit organization is a crisis services specifically for the LGBTQ population. Crisis services can be delivered through direct chat on the website or text message, and also provides a social network for the community. It is unclear how trained their counselors are on the intersections of race, sexuality, and gender, but presents as an integrated resource in the community in the way it also has information about education and advocacy. Stories that are told by members of the LGBTQ community allow outsiders a first-hand glimpse into their world as they see it. Utilizing their values, identities, and cultural heritage, they can tell their own stories with the strengths and struggles they have experienced. Leaving space for people who identify as LGBTQ to tell their own stories is a step allies can take to prevent exploitation. These voices are an asset to the community, especially for the youth of color who may still be wary to speak up and let their own voice be heard for fear of prosecution. LGBTQ youth still face many struggles when it comes to being able to stand up and tell their story, and it becomes even harder for those of color. In the summer of 2008, a 9-year-old boy, Denver native named Jamel Miles, had a conversation with his mother about being gay. After being accepted by his family, Jamel was beyond excited to start the 4th grade at Joe Shoemaker Elementary School and tell his classmates that he was gay because he was proud of himself. The excitement quickly faded when peers started to harass and bully Jamel, telling him that he should go kill himself. Just 4 days into the school year, he took his own life due to the excessive bullying. Stories like Jamel's present the larger society with social issues that the LGBTQ youth face in schools. A lost voice by suicide due to bullying show that there needs to be a policy change in schools with a push for more inclusive education and a more aggressive anti-bullying prevention program.
The next section of our presentation will explore the theoretical applications our group chose to explore with regards to the LGBTQ youth of color community. Ecological theory helps us understand the ways that systems interact to impact individuals and groups. There are different levels of ecological components that help us understand the theory better. The individual is at the center, which includes any biological, psychological, and any unique needs. From there, we have the first layer, called the microsystem, which consists of the immediate environment. The second layer is a mesosystem, which focuses on the interaction of all systems within the microsystem. The third layer is the exosystem, and that itself has different layers. The difference between the meso and exosystems is that meso is a direct system, while the exo is indirect. In other words, they can be differentiated as being seen and unseen influences through its impact. The fourth layer is a macrosystem, which is a larger social and cultural context. The last and fifth layer is a chronosystem, and it takes a look at the role of time in the changes and interactions between systems throughout an individual's life. By understanding each component, we can find ways to intervene in these systems either from a practice standpoint or through policy change. When we apply ecological systems theory to LGBTQ youth of color, we can create a more holistic perspective of their positionality and experiences of intersecting identities. Starting at the micro level, we have the youth, their immediate family, and close friends. At the meso level, we have the interactions between the aforementioned factors in the micro level, as well as acceptance of peers in school, extracurricular activities, and other institutions. The exo level, which is a non-direct level, can look at how the youth's parents and siblings are treated once the youth has come out and how their friends are treated for being friends with an LGBTQ youth of color. The macro level encompasses the overarching societal beliefs and cultural norms. The chrono level ties the progression of change and development together in regards to how the youth's identity develops and changes, how their relationships among the micro, meso, and exo levels develop, and how society's views and values change over time. The model of social action builds from the concept of organizing to overpower an oppressor. According to Hardina, 2002, social action's basic premise is that many groups in society experience oppression because of race, gender, social class, ableism, ageism, and heterosexism. This model suggests strategies for groups to organize and confront those in power in order to have some form of change. Those in power are usually identified as members of the elite who make decisions that affect political, economic, and social systems. Organizers who use this model of change often advocate on behalf of the oppressed. Social action is focused on accomplishing a task. Some examples of tasks include organized protest or mobilization, lobbying for legislation, and developing mass organizations. The Women's March in Denver is a great example of mass protest. Within the last few years, the Women's March has added the X to their name. A quote from the march states, "We are adding an X in our name because we believe in equity and we act with purpose to make space for trans, non-binary, and genderqueer persons in our name." The march promoted the opposition of all forms of oppression while standing in solidarity with all marginalized communities. Coming together as a community, as advocates for oppressed individuals against those in power, is a prime example of how social action attempts to overpower the oppressor. Lobbying for legislation is a social action-related model that can create change on a community level. In February, One Colorado, an LGBTQ community organization based in Denver, organized and sponsored LGBTQ Lobby Day. Members and allies of the LGBTQ community met at the state capitol to meet with senators and House representatives to lobby with them regarding Colorado legislation. Lobbyists asked legislators to support two bills that were introduced into this year's House session. One bill is to end the ban on conversion therapy for minors in Colorado, and the other will make it easier for transgender Coloradans in updating the gender on their birth certificate. The last example of social action is actually a blended model that works together with the community development model of change. Pride Fest is an example of a mass organization which takes place in Denver over a weekend in June. During the 2-day celebration, members and allies of the LGBTQ community come together to enjoy the festivities, which include a 5K run, health and wellness booths, retail and commercial booths, as well as food and beverage stands. Pride Fest also includes various concerts and performances and a large parade. The weekend promotes love and equality among all. With the LGBTQ community being a largely oppressed community, Pride Fest is a time to come together to show those in power that they will not be silenced or powerless. They find strength in gathering together to show others that love is love and acceptance is crucial for the future.
In the next section, we will address questions regarding power analysis, such as who holds power in the community. Before we discuss the issues of power within the LGBTQ community, it's important to note how problematic a hierarchy can be. Though it is a useful tool to analyze how people move through space, it can be taken in a disenfranchised context when people see others' experiences as not as bad, and then equate it with they haven't suffered enough. The LGBTQ youth of color are an oppressed and marginalized population as a whole, but we can break down the power hierarchy even more. As mentioned before, the transgender community within the LGBTQ population have a higher prevalence of the aforementioned issues that face the community as a whole. Other factors like being cis-passing come into play in a power hierarchy as well. The media plays a variety of roles in how the larger society views LGBTQ youth of color, as well as how they view themselves. There are both positives and negatives to the media portrayal of these youth. An annual survey from GLAAD, Where We Are on TV, reports a total of 58 regular characters on TV and 28 reoccurring characters that identify as either lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer. Compared to previous years, the media representation of these LGBTQ individuals is at an all-time high, but when it comes to those of color, they are largely underrepresented. Only 23% of all LGBTQ characters identify as non-white, and this percentage does not take into account which characters are adults and which are youth. There are several resources that have been identified to be lacking within the LGBTQ community, especially for those youth of color. Issues in schools like the lack of education surrounding queer youth is a definite resource that lacks. Implementing a more comprehensive sex education program that includes LGBTQ identities is one way that schools can remedy this issue. However, the education surrounding LGBTQ youth of color extends beyond sex education into normalizing their identities in a more integrated manner. By incorporating a more intersectional framework in queer youth programs, schools and youth programs may be able to develop a more effective resource for queer youth of color and create a more inclusive community. Institutions like surrounding middle schools and high schools, as well as universities such as Metropolitan State and the University of Denver, will impact the community by providing youth who attend programs at Rainbow Alley. One Colorado, the Center, churches and other religious entities, homeless shelters, and other culturally based organizations may also impact the LGBTQ youth of color by providing additional support and resources that Rainbow Alley may not be able to provide within the community boundaries. It is also important to note that the same type of institutions that provide support can also have a detrimental impact as well. For example, some religious institutions can have a lively and inclusive attitude, as well as provide support, while other religious institutions condone the queer community. As a social worker, we have the privilege to have a lot of power. However, in acknowledging the power, it's essential to understand where the client is at and meet them there. Additionally, allowing the client to tell their own story is important. For instance, letting the client use their own words to describe their personal experience is a powerful way to understand the barriers and strifes that they may be going through. Allowing them to be the experts in their own lives and experiences set up a more trusting relationship and can help avoid an exploitative practice. This practice transcends direct communication with the client to how we hold their stories upon leaving the community. In other words, their stories are just that, their stories. Unless we have permission to retell it, it's not ours to share. One practice we can utilize upon leaving the community is to recognize the power we have in our allyship. This means being intentional on how we show up for queer youth of color and how we engage others in conversations when problematic language arises.